The US economy is beginning to show cracks. Manufacturing activity in the US has just declined to 46, a level that is only seen during economic downturns. Typically, when this happens, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, lowers its interest rate. And that kind of saves the economy. You can see manufacturing economic activity seems to pick up again every single time that they do that. When you see the housing market, for example, that is weakening to the same extent that we saw in 2007, manufacturing activity has been collapsing, and the leading economic index is also at recessionary levels. Well, you're probably thinking it's only a matter of time before the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. But you'd be wrong. The Federal Reserve is actually looking to raise interest rates further in November of 2023.
We are prepared to raise rates further if appropriate.
In fact, the target rate probability for the interest rate is currently at 5.5% for November of 2023. That's another 0.25% higher than the current level of the Fed funds rate. That's according to CMEgroup.com. They look at market data to derive a probability model of what the Fed is going to do. I'm not going to be diving into exactly how they do that in this video because that might bore you, but you can check the sources in the description below if you want to dig into it. What they are forecasting today is after raising interest rates once more in November, the Fed will be pausing and keeping interest rates at around the current levels until May of 2024. You see, when the Fed raises interest rates, it makes borrowing money more expensive, which slows the economy down, which also happens to cool inflation down. And the opposite happens when they lower interest rates. So with so many indicators showing that economic activity is going down, why is the Fed looking to raise interest rates? Of course, inflation in the United States, more specifically core inflation, which doesn't take into account the price of food and energy, which can be very volatile and misleading, core inflation is still at decade highs. And as we saw earlier, the Fed fights inflation by raising interest rates.
On the long fight ahead against inflation.
It's fight against inflation.
Raise interest rates at least 3 times in 2022, hoping to ease the staggering inflation.
But even in 1980, when the housing market was as weak as it is today, Paul Volcker, the man who is famous for beating inflation back in the 80s, decided to lower interest rates. And that was with core inflation above 10%. So again, why is the Fed not cutting rates today as inflation is coming down and the housing market is weak and all of these indicators are showing that the economy is weak? One of the key answers to that is that unemployment in the United States today remains extremely low. And that is very important. You see, the two Federal Reserve mandates are maximum employment and price stability. So in other words, low inflation.
On maximum employment and price stability.
These are the two goals of the Fed. When you really boil it down to the essentials, it's maximum employment and price stability. So they've got their employment mandate pretty nailed down, with the unemployment rate being at the lowest level since the 1970s. And the truth is, they still have quite a bit of work to do on the price stability mandate. You see, the Fed's goal is to keep inflation at reasonable levels, and more specifically at 2%. When prices are rising at around a 2% rate, that's meant to reflect a steady economic environment. They want to avoid these large spikes, for example, like we saw in the 1970s and 1980s, or large price declines like we saw in 2009. That's actually called deflation, and it means you're experiencing a pretty severe economic downturn. So the way the Fed sees it right now is that they still have more work to do on the price stability front, and they shouldn't be worrying too much about the maximum employment front. which means given the current strong employment numbers that we're seeing, the Fed is more likely to raise rates rather than lower them, or at least for now. You see, there's a problem with this data set. Most economists agree that the unemployment rate is actually a lagging indicator of the economy. But all the other stuff that we talked about in this video are actually leading indicators of the economy. Manufacturing PMIs, existing home sales, the leading economic index. Leading meaning that these are charts that will weaken or strengthen before the economy starts to head into that direction. Every single time you have the leading economic index going down like it is today, that's followed by a recession. So this could mean that the Fed is currently underestimating how much downside the economy has right now and should actually be cutting rates right now. But it's not that easy. If the Fed were to cut rates aggressively now, it could actually trigger an economic boom very quickly. And if we get another economic boom, that could cause inflation to surge once again. So the truth is the Fed is in a tough spot right now where they need to continue getting inflation down by keeping rates high, but that might come at the cost of more economic pain, perhaps under the form of a rising unemployment rate until they even begin to consider the idea of cutting rates once again. The way we've positioned ourselves at Game of Trades is that we're actually invested in assets that are likely to perform well if the Fed cuts rates too soon, like for example gold, or if the Fed keeps rates too high, which can cause a large economic crisis.